The numbers right now look, well, pretty strong. Anytime I talk about the NHL coming back, a lot of people show up, which tells me people are still interested in hockey because we have our fingers crossed that we're going to have hockey at some point this summer. So, as we look back on the redrafts, I'm wearing a jersey of Patrick Kane because he was the number one draft pick in 2007. I don't see any reason to not make him the number one draft pick in a redraft. Uh, you know, when doing these redrafts, again, I like doing a redraft where I can just redraft everybody that's out of those 30. But in this case, with the 2007 draft, there's too many misses. You got Zach Hamill. He didn't play 100 games. You've got Alex Plant. He didn't play 100 games. Alex Sharapanov, who of course passed away as a prospect for the Rangers. Logan McMillan. He didn't play a game in the NHL. And Angelo Esposito. I'm just going to share here. 2007 proved that we don't always know what we think we know in a draft. So, Angelo Esposito drops to Pittsburgh. And the belief was, you know what? This is going to be a huge steal for the Penguins. I can't believe they're going to get Esposito to go with Malkin and to go with Crosby. Even though there was talk about Esposito's work ethic, which had taken him from potentially being a number one draft pick and bringing him all the way down to here. In reality, we were still like, yeah, but, Pittsburgh does work some wonders. The other thing that stands out in this draft is Gagne gets drafted by the Oilers just before Voracek. Couture's drafted here. They draft Alex Plant here. Pacioretty, of course, got drafted later by Montreal. And then they draft as well Riley Nash just before Max Pacioretty. So theoretically, Edmonton could have walked out of this draft with Jacob Voracek, Max Pacioretty, and Michael Backlund. Would have been a pretty good haul in the first round, but instead they walked out with Sam Gagne, Riley Nash, and Alex Plant. So, this was a draft that's pretty top heavy. Pretty amazing at the top of the draft. So let's go ahead and get to number one. And it kind of has to be to the shock of no one. I'll go with Patrick Kane because of course I will. And what else is there to say? I mean, multiple Stanley Cups. Chicago did very well with that number one pick. They didn't waste it. And I have no reason to pick anybody but him at number one. At number two, that's where I have some questions. So Philadelphia drafting at 2. Logan Couture. He's a scorer. He's tough as nails. I mean, he gets all his teeth knocked out of his head and he goes, yeah, just put a cage on me. I'll go back out on the ice. And jaw wired shut, no problem. I'm fine. Just leave me in the ice. I'm not leaving. Captaincy, he is the heart and soul of that team. Just imagine if Logan Couture had been drafted at number 2 by the Philadelphia Flyers. First off, everybody would have melted down because Couture wasn't rated that highly coming into the draft. But right now, Philly would have looked like absolute geniuses for drafting Couture at number 2. And number 3. Number 3 going to Arizona. Jumping up from position 129 overall is Jamie Benn. Just imagine Jamie Benn in Arizona. First off, again, same idea of, if he had ended up being drafted there, everybody would have lost their minds. But boy, howdy, Jamie Benn in Arizona. That would have, in retrospect, that would have been terrible for Dallas because Jamie Benn was quite the steal at the 129th position. But just think of the lines you could have thrown together in Arizona if they drafted Ben instead. At number 4. Let's see, it's LA. Yeah, I'm going to have LA drafting at 4. Jacob Voracek. I remember when they drafted Thomas Hickey. It surprised people because Hickey wasn't considered to be a top 4 draft pick. And there was a lot of complaints that, if they were going to draft him, they could have traded down. Definitely could have traded down. Now, again, when you're trading down, there's some risk to that. But Thomas Hickey was definitely a reach at 4 and then never played a game for LA. So he's been a decent enough defenseman with the Islanders, but never played a game in LA. after they drafted him. So I'm going with Voracek to LA. Just imagine Voracek on a line with Kopitar. Yeah, that's pretty solid. At number 5. Yeah, number 5. Yeah, he kind of has to go here. I know a lot of people don't like PK Subban on a personal level. He was the number 43 draft pick that year. I know there are people who think that he as a player isn't anywhere near what he used to be, but PK Subban, in his prime, his best days, pretty fantastic. And just imagine him on the blue line for the Capitals. He'd have Carlson and Subban. Again, I think his contract drags him down. I think his cap hit drags him down. He still has had a very solid career. And I think he can still bounce back. But based on the overall career, I kind of have to have Subban at least that high on here. Next up. And this is where it gets kind of... I mean, it's not like you can take a bad pick here out of the ones I got left over. All right. Moving way, way up, Max Pacioretty. Max Pacioretty ends up going to the Edmonton Oilers. So Pacioretty goes to the Oilers at the number 6 spot. And again, that would have been a pretty bold move by the Oilers, because that would have been a move that was kind of off the board. I mean, again, Patches ends up going to Montreal. But Pacioretty with the Oilers would look pretty good on the wing with McDavid. Or I mean, if things continue to fall apart for the Oilers after that, he would look pretty good with whoever they were drafting at that number 1 spot. And while Gagne's had a decent run along the way, he hasn't been bad. He's still going to be on the board in this first round. You can't put him in the same category as a Pacioretty. Number 7. Yeah, I'm going to put him at 7. David Perron going to Columbus at 7. I remember when David Perron was still on the board and the Canucks go up. And Canuck fans were all like, this is great. We're going to get Perron. Perron's fallen to us. This is going to be awesome. And then they drafted Patrick White. And all the air went out of the building on that one. And to this day, you can't justify Patrick White being the draft pick. You just can't. And Perron still being on the board. And it's one of those ones that just, when you see it on the board, it kind of hurts you as a Canuck fan, doesn't it? But Perron goes to Columbus in this redraft, so they lose Voracek. Voracek ends up in LA, but they get Perron. That's not a bad trade-off. Perron showed his championship medal last year with St. Louis, and that was after showing it with Vegas prior to that as well. So Perron's a winner, and he's a very, very strong competitor. So I'm going to have him at number 7. At number 8, Boston doesn't draft Zach Hamel, because who'd be crazy enough to do that? Well, Boston. Ryan McDonagh. Ryan McDonagh to the Bruins. McDonagh, excellent top 4 defenseman, top 2 at times in his career as well. And seeing him with the Bruins would have been nice, but they drafted Zach Hamel. And it was pretty obvious pretty early on that Zach Hamel, it just didn't work. And so it just, as a Bruins fan, it's one of those ones that there aren't very many that bother me. That one kind of bothers me because look, they drafted Zach Hamel just before San Jose came up and drafted Logan Couture. If Couture had been a Bruin, just imagining that would have been nice, but nope, can't have nice things. So next up, okay. Yeah. To San Jose. James Van Riemsdyk. He's had a challenging year this year, and, the goal scoring hasn't been quite where you might expect it to be, but he's been a solid player. He's been a solid goal scorer. I like James Van Riemsdyk. I think he's a good player. You lose Couture, you get Van Riemsdyk. Look at that, they switched spots. Didn't plan that, but that's nice. So basically, Philly just traded James Van Riemsdyk to get Logan Couture. And you take that trade all day long. if you're Philly, because as much as I do like James Van Riemsdyk, who was drafted by Philly and ends up back in Philly, Couture's the better player. But again, James Van Riemsdyk, not a bad consolation prize there. Now, next on the board, well, Florida's on the board. So I kind of like. Yeah. Yeah, I kind of like doing this, and this can be called lazy if you'd like. That's fine too. I will accept that if people want to say that of me. But moving up from 71st into the first round of the draft is Evgeny Dadonov. Dadonov has been fantastic for Florida on that first line for the last couple of years, and if he leaves that team, I think they'll miss him. I do. I think if he ends up going as a UFA and going somewhere else, I really think they're going to miss him on that team. I think he's underrated. I think he's a player that flies under the radar because he hasn't played his entire career in the NHL. He did go to the KHL for a while in the middle there. And I think he gets overlooked. I think Dadonov is a good forward, and I think he's a solid top 6 player. And again, I'm taking Dadonov here ahead of some other pretty darn good players. So for Carolina, that one's tempting, but that guy's just having more of a career year than anything else. So at the next spot, it must be something with Carolina and defensemen, where Carolina's up, and I say, you know what? Alec Martinez moves up from number 95 into the first round and ends up going to Carolina. So add Martinez to Slavin and Pesce and Hamilton, and you guys get the idea. It's a pretty good blue line they've got put together in Carolina, and Martinez would fit right in. Vegas fans found out pretty darn quick why Martinez was highly sought after on the market this year, and Martinez still has a year left on his contract. So it's not a pure rental situation, and Martinez, pretty solid top 4 defenseman all around, and it's nice to see him get his opportunity with Vegas to potentially go through some playoffs this year, and we'll see what happens with him. In the next spot, to Montreal. It's not Ryan McDonough. Not that they would ever lose Ryan McDonough, of course. Michael Backlund. And Michael Backlund moves up from Calgary's spot to Montreal's. Backlund's an interesting one. When he was drafted, I think the expectation was more offense than he's shown to this point. But he's developed a pretty good two-way game. And he's become a better forward, I think, than we might have thought early on. And it's one of those things where, you're drafted as a first rounder, you kind of reinvent yourself after you're drafted. Backlund's kind of done that. And he's been solid. I can't say that I've had complaints about his game along the way. Now St. Louis is drafting next. Of the defensemen that are left, I'll have Jake Muzzin go there. Jake Muzzin is perfect for the St. Louis Blues. Jake Muzzin is exactly the defenseman that looks like and feels like a guy who plays for the Blues. There's a reason the Maple Leafs got him and have signed him to a long-term extension. Jake Muzzin is that physical defenseman they didn't have. And he's got some offense to his game as well. He's a pretty well-rounded blue liner, and he's underrated. Next up is going to be... This guy doesn't move. There you go. Kevin Shattenkirk was drafted by Colorado. I think Shattenkirk still ends up at the same spot. Excellent all-around defenseman. He's had his overpriced contracts. Lord knows the tour in New York didn't work out for him, but he's been pretty good in Tampa, and he's had some good runs along the way. So, yeah, Shattenkirk. Next up, to Edmonton. I'm going to send them Lars Eller. Another underrated player. Lars Eller is an underrated player. And not by Caps fans. Caps fans know how good he is. And I don't think underrated by Montreal fans either. I think that Eller was a loss for Montreal that I think they still feel it on some level. Lars Eller is absolutely one of those underrated forwards in the NHL. Next spot. So we're into the bottom half of the draft here. And I'll go with Carl Hagelin. Goes to Minnesota. He was originally drafted 168th overall. Hagelin, decent forward, wins championships, and he's been prominent on championship teams. Now, again, this is over the length of his career. I'd have him at this level, even though I will admit, in terms of raw talent, I would probably have Kyle Turris ahead of him. Kyle Turris drops from number 3 down to the New York Rangers spot. So at 17, Kyle Turris goes to the New York Rangers. Turris has had a bit of a rough go of it with Nashville. And he had a rough end to his time with Ottawa. And I think that overall that downturn has hurt his value. I hope he bounces back. Whether that's in Nashville or whether it's somewhere else, doesn't matter to me. Kyle Turris has always been a forward that I've liked. I was a big fan of his when he was in Ottawa. And it sucked to see him leave. And we'll see whether or not Turris can bounce back. But for me right now, I have him below the other guys that are on the board. Next off of my cheat sheet here will be, again, I don't plan this out ahead of time because what's life without whimsy? Wayne Simmonds. Simmonds was originally taken 61st overall, so I have him going to the Blues. So you have Jake Muzzin and Wayne Simmonds going to the Blues instead of Lars Eller and Ian Cole. That's not bad. That's pretty good. As far as I'm concerned, you've upgraded both draft picks. And Simmonds and Muzzin both on the Blues, that would have been a pretty rough and tough team. Not that Eller wasn't good and not that Ian Cole isn't a good defenseman as well. Cole will end up on the board before this is all done, and Eller only dropped 2 spots when he's drafted. So Wayne Simmonds for me, is he on the downswing? Yes. Has he had a good career? Also yes. And he's had some pretty solid seasons along the way. So Simmonds comes off the board, and then one of my favorites was drafted by Tampa. I don't have the number written down, but I think he was 77th overall that year. Alex Killorn. So Alex Killorn jumps up into the first round and goes to Anaheim instead of Tampa. Killorn is having a career year. He's the one I mentioned earlier. I wanted to put in kind of this row, but he is having a career year. I think next year it probably comes back down to more normal levels, but yeah, I have Killorn being drafted there. Next off of my cheat sheet here, he did end up playing there. He's drafted 173rd overall, and that's Nick Bonino. Gets drafted by Pittsburgh in my redraft. Angelo Esposito is not in the top 30. Just throwing that out there, spoiler alert, he is not in the top 30. I have Nick Bonino going to Pittsburgh, and that's excellent for the Penguins. Because, again, it's an upgrade over Esposito, right? Number 20 to the Edmonton Oilers. You know what's kind of funny? I really think Sam Gagner belongs here. Not a word of a lie. I think Sam Gagner belongs at that point in the draft, so Sam Gagner ends up going to the Oilers anyways, and they have Max Pacioretty as well. Montreal. Who would Montreal take out of the remaining players? One that I think is underrated, although he drops in this redraft. Brandon Sutter. Yes, Brandon Sutter's overpaid. Yes, Brandon Sutter was given a contract that was too long by Jim Benning. Yes, it's a poor contract. But also, yes, he can be an excellent third-line center. I know, he does tend to get injured. It's definitely hindered his ability to go out there every night and do what he does best. But Brandon Sutter, of players that I've seen live, I've been very, very impressed with him in Vancouver games I've watched. I've honestly come out of those games going, you know what? That Sutter guy's pretty darn good. He's pretty useful. I don't like the contract either, but he's pretty useful to the team. So, Brandon Sutter goes to Montreal, and that's along with Michael Backlund. It's not too bad. That's pretty good down the middle right there, adding Backlund and Sutter. Although instead of McDonough and Pacioretty, that's a downgrade at both. Compliments to the guys they took, not an insult to the guys they didn't. Next to go off of my cheat sheet here, I'll go with Ian Cole. So Ian Cole goes from St. Louis, drops down to Nashville. Again, good top 6 defenseman, top 4. And he's had some rough patches along the way, but useful in the right situation. Most defensemen are going to have that, though. I mean, look, I got PK Subban on the top row, and he's had a lot of down points along the way. McDonough at times is seen as a Norris Trophy contender, and at other times people are like, they need to get rid of that McDonough. The guy isn't any good. The reality is, neither of those things may very well be all that accurate. Next up, to Calgary. I'm going to send them. They don't get Michael Backlund. He's already off the board. But they will get Pat Maroon, who moves up from the 161st spot to the first round where he goes to Calgary. So Patrick Maroon ends up being a Calgary Flame. Next up, Vancouver. No, I'm not going to have them draft Patrick White. As funny as that would be to say Patrick White still goes to the Canucks because ridiculousness, I'm not doing it. So next up, I'm going to go with a guy who was overrated a couple of years ago. And I said that. I said I thought Paul Byron as a goal scorer was kind of overrated. But Paul Byron, who's drafted 179th that year, he's a pretty solid all-around competitor. And injuries have played their part with him over the last year. But I still like Byron. I still think he could be a 20-goal scorer. Again, it's going to depend on health. It's going to depend on the opportunity, which line he's on and all that. But I like Paul Byron. So he goes to Vancouver. Going to St. Louis. I'm going to send Justin Braun, who may very well be another underrated player in the NHL. Justin Braun goes to St. Louis. So St. Louis comes out of this draft with Justin Braun, Wayne Simmons, and Jake Muzzin. So 2 top 6 defensemen and a top 9 forward. Not too shabby. But originally they came out of this with Lars Eller, Ian Cole, and David Perron. So that's pretty good too. Perron's up here, so yeah, he moves from here to here. That's just crazy. Brendan Smith is not in this redraft, but he does get an honorable mention. And I wanted to have Brendan Smith in this, but I guess he would have been picked number 31 on my redraft because he doesn't quite make the cut on this one. So honorable mention there to Brendan Smith. At the next spot, I don't have the draft position down for Carl Gunnarsson, but I'm going to have Gunnarsson taken at 27. So instead of Brendan Smith, they take Gunnarsson with that pick for Detroit. So is it an upgrade? Kind of, sort of. The one thing I like with Brendan Smith, the reason that he gets an honorable mention is because he's proven he can play defense or play forward. And much like Mark Pesek, he's done it well. And it's a situation not all defensemen excel at. Not all forwards excel if they get moved to the blue line for any reason either. So kudos to him for being able to do that. In the next spot, going to San Jose, Riley Nash, who drops from here down to here. I like Riley Nash. He's had a bit of a rough break since going to Columbus. Loved him in Boston. It may be the system in Boston that benefited Riley Nash more than Nash benefited their system. Maybe that's what I've seen with him in Columbus, which would explain why he's where he is on the draft. But I like Nash's compete level. I think he's a good forward, and I think in San Jose, I think they would have still drafted him. Number 29, all the way down from number 4 there, Thomas Hickey. So Jim O'Brien does not get drafted 29th overall by Ottawa. He slips out of the first round. And Nick Ross is not drafted 30th overall by the Coyotes. Instead, Karl Alzner falls all the way down there. So Hickey was 4, drops to 29th. Alzner was 5, drops to 30th. So there's no exact science when it comes to drafting. And I expect people to have their disagreements with me about who got drafted where. But I came up with my top 30. I did look up other redrafts, and my 30 picks line up with other 30 picks. I made sure I had my 30 picks first before I looked up anybody else's redraft. There were a couple of head scratchers that I saw in the redrafts I looked up, and I thought, well, that seems a little bit high or that seems a little bit low. So understandably, it's still conjecture and opinion. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below as always. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you're browsing your way through. You just happened upon this video. And hey, thank you guys so much for watching. And we're learning teams that pick first usually get that pick right with the #1 overall choice. Thanks again for all your support. I will talk to you again soon.